Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Choice and Towards Inclusive Excellence, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Equitable Staffing Models in the Current and Post-Pandemic Landscape, which is underwritten by Gobi Library Solutions. Gobi Library Solutions from EBSCO offers more than 17 million print and ebooks to academic research and special libraries worldwide. From streaming workflows to partnering with library staff, Gobi Library Solutions is committed to providing the best solutions for libraries' acquisition, collection development, and technical service needs. Today's panel is part of a new initiative at Choice called Toward Inclusive Excellence. If you'd like to receive updates about new blog posts in the series, upcoming webinars, and podcast episodes, please use the link in the chat box to sign up, and I will drop that in there real quick for you. Also, please know, there we go. Before we start everything up today, I'd like to take just a couple of moments to point out a few features of the webinar software. Please note that all of the attendees who are joining us today are automatically muted and your cameras are disabled. So don't worry about generating noise or feedback or anything like that. That should be taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, right now, you'll be able to follow along with the presentation materials, but today's discussion is really a panel discussion. So there won't be any slides or anything like that after this brief intro. We are using the Q&A feature today. If you have questions for any of the panelists, please drop your questions into that box at the end of the discussion. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for. So please do add your questions throughout the presentation. But also, please know that our time is limited and we will get to as many as we can, but we may not get to them all. There is also closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle those automated captions on or off, you can use the little CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. If you're active on Twitter, we'd encourage you to use the hashtag #TIWebinar to live tweet the program and interact with the panel. Also note that we are recording today's program and that everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And it is my pleasure right now to turn things over to Alexia Hudson-Ward to say a few words about Toward Inclusive Excellence and to introduce today's panel. So over to you, Alexia.
Thank you so much, Mark, and welcome to all of our participants for today's important conversation about equitable staffing models in the current and post-pandemic landscape. I too extend my appreciation to Gobi for their support of today's webinar. So as Mark shared, everyone, the hosting entity for today's panel is Choice's new initiative Toward Inclusive Excellence, or TIE. I am proud to serve as TIE's editor-in-chief, and we seek to provide solution-centered discourse and concepts grounded in the current research on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, belonging, and social justice within the academy. We will highlight various programmatic initiatives already underway and also feature a multitude of subject matter experts through podcasts, blog postings, and panel discussions. We encourage you to subscribe to TIE for weekly content and feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in contributing. If you plan to contribute to the real-time digital discourse about today's panel discussion, please use hashtag #TIEWebinar. Again, hashtag #TIEWebinar. We also ask for your patience and grace as we may encounter technological issues throughout our webinar today. So just hang in there with us and we'll address the matter as soon as we can. So I am thrilled to facilitate today's discussion and introduce these four remarkable leaders who are advancing a series of transformational DEIA initiatives within their respective libraries, their institutions, and for the profession. First is Chris Berg, who is the director of MIT Libraries. Chris is leading her libraries and standing firm on addressing inequities within commercial models of scholarly publishing through a framework that has been adopted by many academic libraries. Next is Teresa Bird, Dean of the University Library at the University of San Diego. In addition to advancing DEIA in her library, Teresa is also serving as the chair of the search committee for the university's inaugural Chief Diversity Officer as appointed by the institution's provost. Our next panelist is Terry Schneider, college librarian at Haverford College. Terry is among the first academic library directors to incorporate the need for staff to thrive as central to the success of any diversity initiative and imperative within her library's strategic plan. And next is Elaine Westbrook, Vice Provost for University Libraries and University Librarian at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Elaine announced her library's Reckoning Initiative last week, which is a multifaceted program and framework aimed at advancing anti-racism and DEIA within the libraries. Thank you all so much for joining us. I have 4 questions and I will rotate who I will ask to respond first. I also ask that the panelists either raise your physical hand or use the raise hand feature in Zoom so I can make sure to catch you as much as I can. We have approximately 35 minutes for this portion of our discussion today. And I do hope that all of you will give our panelists a virtual round of applause. So the first question goes to Terry. So Terry, in which ways have you and your team created or are planning to create equitable staffing models in support of your institution's fall reentry process?
Sure thing. Thanks, Alexia. It occurs to me that we all are in a shared place where we had to go virtual in March of 2020, but that subsequent to that, we are likely in different places. So the historian in me wants to offer a little bit of context around where where we've been in order to know where we're going. So we reopened to the campus. We reopened the library to the campus in August of 2020. And one of our overarching frameworks is radical access to the libraries and to the resources, the collections, to the expertise. And so it was really important to us that we reopen as quickly, as safely, and as robustly as we could. Nonetheless, because we were in a pandemic, we had staffing at about 25% in person and 75% remote. And so we had to generate sort of a real robust program of virtual services, digital pedagogies, and the like. Many of you have done that, and it's been exciting and really interesting to see what opportunities the pandemic has actually afforded to us. We also rely heavily on student colleagues, and that ratio was about the same, 30% in person and the balance offering remote work. And so that was a bit of a game changer. And we could do that at Haverford for 4 reasons. We could reopen for 4 reasons. One, we're a smaller community, and so we could manage the safety protocols fairly well, although that was challenging. We have a new building, and it promoted safety through our furniture manipulation and through our air handling. We had RFID technology, so there was safe self-checkout. And we also have an honor code that really is underscored by the values of trust, concern, and respect. So we wanted to live into that value proposition and create, as I said, as robust a learning opportunity curricularly and co-curricularly for our community. So now we're all at a turning point, right? And so for Haverford, June 1st is the mark where we are invited to come back to campus. The expectation is that we will return in the fall. And as of June 1st, each leader of the organizational units has the discretion to call people back. From an equity perspective for the libraries, we won't issue a global mandate. We are really interested, that would be equality, but not equity, so to speak. So we're really focused on trying to figure out the right framework. And again, as a historian, I'm going to kind of go back to what worked for us. And that was a compassionate and really holistic framework around what we were trying to do to meet the needs of our community, appreciating that we as librarians are also part of that community, right? So in large measure, what guides us is our strategic plan, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is threaded throughout our strategic plan. So we're really focused on how do we achieve that. And so the way we'll do that as we return is to think about it through all staff meetings, through departmental meetings, through our leadership team meetings. And I also, because we're smaller, we have 27 FTEs in the library, non-student FTEs. I'm able periodically to have one-on-one meetings with my non-reports. And so that gives me the opportunity to see where they are in relationship to their successes, what has been working for them in terms of the remote work, how they situate themselves in a place of safety and security, and what concerns are emerging for them as we come back to our work. So I think actually we have more equity issues in the virtual world than we will as we reemerge. And that's actually the good news, because it allows us to really focus on what we're hoping to achieve. Nonetheless, the conversations are surfacing some issues, parental leave, other issues. Training is a big deal for us. And so sort of figuring out how do we approach that, particularly in this kind of a climate and environment. And so also sort of paying attention to what those needs are. We've been distant for this long a period. How do we reemerge in a way that allows people to attend to childcare, to parental leave, to even things like we were talking earlier about commutes, right? Challenging commutes and whatnot. So thinking about what are the array of those issues and then dealing with those in a comprehensive way. Now, our leadership team is really eager to come back. We see a real value. We are a residential college and we want to see that happen. But we also appreciate that if we all came back at once, it would create a strain and some pressure on our direct reports. And so we are planning to stage our own return to model the space for our colleagues to actually take the time that they need to transition. So what have we learned? We know that remote work offers possibilities. It can happen, and there's a heightened level of trust on campus for the success of the remote work, right? We also were very flexible pre-pandemic around some work-life issues. And so we expect to return to some of that, and our provost is exceedingly supportive. Meanwhile, our college is also considering working out a trial work from home policy because we see some benefits. Looking further out, I think there are opportunities for recruitment and retention from an equity perspective around what we learned in the pandemic and the remote circumstances. There are potential losses, and we have to pay attention to those. Departmentally and things worked, individual agency has been heightened, but there is sort of the holistic team that we have to really pay attention to. And I think that there are long-term losses if we stayed in this remote fashion. And then finally,
thank you so much. Oh no, please go right ahead.
One more point. I'm sorry, Alexia.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
We are a residential college, right? And we're all supporting our institution, right? And so we want to balance out that the mission of the college to be present in a physical community, to be viable, to be available for our faculty, our students, and our staff. So sorry to go on.
No, it was really a very rich response. Thank you. And you raised a lot of very interesting points. I want to check in with our other panelists to see if someone would like to build on any of Terry's points or share some additional perspective around how you and your teams are planning to create equitable staffing models. Yeah, please go right ahead, Teresa. Thank you.
Share one point. We've done many of the things that Terry has talked about at a medium-sized university. So I won't go over those, but I think one of the things that we did during COVID, when it was particularly bad, the Access Services team broke the staff up into teams. And therefore, if a staff member got infected, the whole department did not get infected. So in other words, the head of the Access Services librarian had half the staff come in on Tuesday, Thursday, and the other staff came in on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That was done over the weekend staff, graduate students, everyone who was working. And we did have a case of COVID, but it didn't mean we had to have 11 people quarantined. So I think that's something that we will also bring to our reopening plan in the fall.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to check in with Chris and Elaine before we move on to our next question to see if you have any thoughts you'd like to share. Yeah, please go right ahead, Elaine.
I would just add, one of the things we did was we had staff who are not part of the circulation staff who came in and actually worked on the desk. And that was a way, because we didn't want the access services staff to unfairly bear the burden of all of the work, the risk. And so creating pods that could protect against infection, but also bring in people, and we're talking about programmers, people who were liaisons, they were working the front desk, and that made a major difference. And then the other part was leadership team essentially focused on compliance just to make sure students were wearing masks. So the management team did that and made sure that they did rounds, walked around, made sure things were okay. And I think that helped create a safe environment, particularly for our staff.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, Chris, please go right ahead.
Yeah, let me just wrap this up by saying that, you know, hearing what everyone else is doing really emphasizes to me the point about how much local context really matters, both your sort of local community guidelines and state guidelines, as well as what kind of institution you are, right? So, and that there are lots of ways to try and serve your community and provide the essential services and ramp those back up in some kind of safe way while keeping your staff safe in as equitable a way as you possibly can, right? So we heard about shifts, and we heard about bringing different people in to do jobs they wouldn't normally do to spread the burden. What we were able to do, and I recognize that's because of our own local context, is that we've been able to, for the most part, single staff our library locations and it's only staff in those locations. So we're shipping physical items. We're not even doing curbside checkout, and we have not allowed any patrons in the spaces yet. So our staff who are going back to campus are going back as pretty much single, maybe a handful of folks in a library, but with, you know, tons of space around them, and at an institution that has a really robust testing protocol for anyone who's on campus, and really strict access limits to who can go inside buildings. So I just want to emphasize that there has been no one size fits all way to try to approach this extraordinary situation with a lens of equity and safety. There are lots of models.
Right.
And I think, you know, I applaud all my colleagues for finding ones that work in their context. And I feel like we found one that worked pretty well in ours.
I think
Yes, thank you.
communication with your team is the way you're going to find the answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. The next question goes to Elaine. And so Elaine, academic library staff and many of our higher education colleagues report feeling like this heightened sense of stress and burnout since the onset of the COVID pandemic crisis. What are some of the methodologies that you and your teams are employing to provide support for staff while also making sure that you can advance the libraries and the institution's goals?
Well, I think I would put the answer to that question in 4 areas. I think the first thing is you need to name what is going on. And so to me, you had to be clear that we had 2 pandemics. We had one racism and one of COVID, and we were all experiencing a trauma. And so you have to name it. We're experiencing white supremacy. And so you name these things and acknowledge that all of us are going through a unique period in time. And I think that was like the first thing you have to start with. The second thing I would say is that there has to be prioritizing of wellness, and connected to wellness is safety. And I would say that I actually did not do that before, and I regret that. But when this pandemic hit us, it became clear to me that wellness has to be not the means to an end, but the goal. Like the goal is to be well, to lead for wellness, to have our staff understand that, that we want to have compassion, grace, and empathy. And that is how you cultivate a mindset on wellness. And then connected to that, of course, is safety, that we're not going to compromise anyone's safety so that someone can get a book or so that we want to make a group happy. Like, we had to really enforce that we had all the things in place so that people could be safe. The third area I would mention is just, yeah, and I think even, I don't know if you mentioned it, Terry or Teresa, but it's communication. Like, you have to communicate. And that the more you communicate, it cultivates the trust. And so when the pandemic first broke out, we were having meetings with our department heads every week. And sometimes we would have 3 or 4 in 1 week, because when, you know, as you remember, things were just changing so quickly. And so we would have
Yes.
updates, and I would literally just set up a meeting at 2 o'clock and invite the department heads and basically say, please take this information back to your teams, because this is really, really important. Because you have to remember, it was just there were so many things we didn't know. And so whenever I was able to get information from the campus, I would bring it back and share that as quickly as I could. I think that whole communicating what you know and when you know it just cultivates trust, respect, and it also signaled good intention, and that these are things that cultivate trust, is that we really wanted people to feel like they were in the know, and to feel somewhat empowered, because I know throughout this entire process, I did not have a playbook. I've never lived through a pandemic before. So I felt powerless. And so if I felt powerless, I can imagine how many members of my staff felt powerless. And I think, you know, we're dealing with childcare, we're dealing with people who are getting sick, we're dealing with so many different things. And so one of the things we did was we set up blogs. And so we had a blog for reckoning and diversity. We had a blog for COVID, and we had a blog, well, actually, and then we had a blog for wellness, and then we merged it. But we thought the wellness one was the most important. And so it was great. Like, I did a kombucha class. We were doing ice cream making, bird watching. My personal favorite is drag bingo. That was amazing.
Nice.
We did watch parties. We did walking groups, walking challenges. We also had caucuses. So we had caucuses for BIPOC to talk about reckoning, to create safe spaces. And so these channels that we created were actually pushed out every morning. And so you would get a COVID update every morning, a wellness update, and a reckoning update. And then, you know, in some ways it could seem like it was overkill, but it was really pushing out all the things that we thought people might need to know. And then we also wanted to make it clear that this work for wellness was not extra work, or, you know, like, this is stuff you do while you're working. And that means you will take a break and sit in on a bird watching class. And that was perfectly fine to be able to do something like that. And so I think that was a significant shift for a lot of people. And I would also add, with the reckoning work, it's the same thing. It's, if you're invested and committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you cannot think that it's something extra or tangential. You have to change work. You have to change the way you work. And it's not a calculus problem. It's like, if I just had more time, I would do it. No, this isn't about time. This is about the quality of your work and the way you approach your work. And so I think that the pandemic and the whole environment that we were all experiencing actually made, it gave us a lot of opportunities to experiment, hit or miss. You know, we tried some programs, other programs were bust, some were really good. So I think those 3 or 4 things were, I think, very helpful in keeping morale up. Giving people grace and compassion and empathy is really the most important thing that you could do as leaders.
Thank you so much. It was actually Terry that raised the matter of communication. And so I want to pull back to you, Terry, to see if you would like to iterate on some of the amazing points that Elaine just raised.
Well, I'd like to come and work for her. I guess is what I want to say. It's a tougher nut to crack. Like for my team, they don't actually like a lot of sort of organized fun. But what they care a lot about is, and again, as Chris said, this is local, right? So my team really cared a lot about communication. So we met a lot. And it was both a strength and a weakness. It was exhausting because people were meeting more, but it was important that everybody be informed and felt like, they were part of, they were pulling hard at the oar together, right? We were moving together on what we were trying to accomplish. One thing that Elaine provoked that I hadn't considered is we also had a student strike on campus around BIPOC issues. And, quite right. It's a dual pandemic. And so in the midst of the stress of the health pandemic, there was this overarching element. And we spent a lot of time talking about that, coming together in impromptu meetings to discuss what was happening on campus and how we could contribute to a better environment for our BIPOC and first-gen students. So yeah, communication is the key.
Thank you. I want to check in with you, Teresa, to see if you have some points to share.
Yes, Elaine, I love the way she broke it up into the 4 frames. And so I can just chime in there. So on June 11th, we will have a healthy work environment, professional development opportunity. We usually, about a year or so ago, we started doing once a semester, we do a professional development activity together, and that happens to be the topic for coming up on June 11th. In addition to that, a group of people in Copley Library, mostly all of the people of color, and 2 white males were selected to participate in the university's administrative staff and racial justice group. It's an anti-racism group, and we've been spending a lot of time in affinity groups. It's intergenerational, and I find that it's really exciting to be with students, grad students, with younger faculty, and we all, have something to share and a perspective. Topics like code switching has been debated. And so we just have a good time, and it's an hour. And we share various perspectives on those issues. The other thing I think that Copley Library has done, and the University of San Diego has been very supportive of librarians and staff with children during the pandemic. They have been able to stay home with their kids, and everyone in the organization is supportive of that. So I think those are a few things that I can add that from the perspective here at Copley Library and the University of San Diego.
Thank you. And Chris, would you like to share some perspective as well?
Yeah, let me just build on some of what everyone has said, and that Elaine teed up around wellness, and share some of what we've been able to do at MIT. So a couple of things that we did was we've had a couple of what we've called sort of wellness days, or mental health days, where we cancel all meetings. And in fact, we were able on a couple of occasions to get permission to shut off all services, right, which were virtual anyway, but no chat reference, no nothing. You can hold your question till tomorrow. And actually with no programming at all, just people's job that day was to do whatever they needed to do on that day to take care of themselves. And people were encouraged to self-organize and do things with each other if they wanted, or totally disengage from all their work colleagues for a day if they wanted. We also have had what we call organizational pause, our meeting-free weeks, because so many of us are spending hours in this Zoom box, and it's exhausting. And so we've declared at least twice, maybe 3 times in the last year, we've picked weeks that work for us and work for the university, and said no non-essential meetings. And we learned from that experience to caution people from loading up meetings the week before or the week after, because that will undo the good that comes from a meeting-free week. And we also learned that for some people, especially early on in the pandemic, a meeting-free week was actually really hard. We had colleagues who live alone and their only human interaction was with us over Zoom. And so we learned along the way. And the other thing I think I want to add is for all of these issues, I think this experience has, for me, and I think for my colleagues and for the organization, has helped us become a lot more comfortable with flexibility and making rapid change, right? Libraries aren't known, our academia is not known for changing quickly. And I feel like we all had to learn how to be comfortable with adjusting things based on what we learned last week and doing it different the next week or the next month. And I think that's a good lesson to hold on to. So.
Yeah, thank you. What a rich dialogue so far. This is super exciting. So we have a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so Teresa, the next question goes to you. So how do you and your leadership team strive to balance equity between support staff and administrative staff?
Okay, thank you, Alexia. Well, I and the leadership team strive to balance and to have equitable and an inclusive environment with all personnel in the library. We have a number of committees and both staff and faculty are on committees. Professional development opportunities are offered to all. Even our staff do get to do some traveling. And we also try to adhere to flex hours in terms of schedules. But here's the deal. I have tenured faculty, okay, here in the library. And that in itself sometimes creates a little bit of, some people would say unfairness, but the faculty have all of the rights that tenured faculty have on campus. They are members of the Faculty Senate. They report to the provost. We are under the division of the provost. The staff in the library report to HR or are under HR guidelines. So there's a big latitude in what the benefits are. And that's across all universities. Tenured faculty have some benefits that staff don't have. That's just the way the world works. I can say that throughout the pandemic, we had a staff member, in fact, who volunteered. He kept ILL and the book collection circulating to grad students and faculty from March 19th, when we closed, until now, until October 5th, when we opened. Here in San Diego, the County of San Diego dictated quite a bit of what happened in terms of whether or not an organization could be open. And as you might recall, the virus was pretty bad in California for a while, and the county did not allow us to open until October 5th. At that point, when the county allowed us to open, the Collections Access and Discovery Department came back to campus, and they have worked in the building ever since. The good news here is that in that department, we do have 2 library faculty members, the Access Services librarian and the head of Collections Access and Discovery. One is tenured, one is tenure track. They both also worked in the library for the entire duration once the library has opened. As Elaine, I think, indicated, we also had a few other people in the library who decided to come in and help out at the Access Services desk. Because one of the things that we did not have our work study return because we are a little bit afraid of co-locating students with the staff because of the spread of the virus. So we still don't have our students back yet, but we'll need them to open in the fall. I can share that our campus actually vaccinated people. And so in February, when the university decided it would vaccinate essential personnel, I insisted that they vaccinate the Collections Access and Discovery team. They said the library was essential. Well, if we're going to be open, we need to be vaccinated, and they did agree. And so both staff and faculty in that department were vaccinated. The librarians, as I said, are tenured. Most of them are still working remote, not all, but the majority are still working remotely. But the president has mandated that on August 1, everyone must be vaccinated and everyone must return to campus, particularly those people who are student facing. The only exemptions for vaccination will be medical or so religion. And you'll have to go to HR to get those exemptions. So it is at this point that the tenured faculty too will have to return to campus. We have 2 desks in the library. Like Terry, we had a brand new library, it was just renovated. And we actually had to clear the whole first floor to turn it into a COVID library. Brand new furniture we put in storage and put up 45 reserved seats. But the tenured faculty have been told that they too will be expected to return to work. We can't have the access services team working at the access services desk and then the reference desk is empty. So at last week's faculty meeting, I shared that they too would be required to come back to work and work at the desk. And as someone has already indicated, I've suggested that, do a trial run. I'm in my office today. I can tell you that the first day I came to work, I couldn't find my shoes. It was tough, getting the route down. Traffic here is everything in California. And if you're 20 minutes late, you got a whole new traffic pattern. So I encourage the faculty to get started. And, I think that they will do that because at the end of the day, we're all one team and everyone needs to feel like we're all required to return to work. I can share with you recently in the last 2 weeks, I have run into 2 issues about what's equitable, what's not. A staff member just point blank said, well, 80% of the building isn't here. Of course, I knew what she was referring to. So it basically just came down to the fact that an individual wanted to do something that was not allowed under HR rules. Whether or not you're working remotely or working in the building, if you want to take personal time, you take vacation. And so that was how we arrived at that decision. But, I think we're in a good place as long as people start getting ready in their mind. And I think it's a mindset because we've almost been out of work for about 1.5 years. Not out of work, but out of the office. And It's not as easy as coming downstairs in my slippers and sliding to my office. And I shouldn't have said slippers, but anyway, everybody knows we wear slippers. And sliding under the desk, right? I have my own office at home as it is when I have to get fully dressed and come into the office. So I'll stop there, but we'll be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Teresa. All of you all are raising such amazing points. And so I want to check in with Chris on this matter of, balancing equity between staff and support staff, and administrative staff.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot there, Alexia.
Anytime.
And again, local context is everything. So we do not have faculty status. None of the library staff at MIT have faculty status, but we do have this 2 different kinds of staff status, which is the support staff, hourly and salaried administrative staff, some of whom are librarians and archivists, and some of whom are not. I guess I'm going to be the bad guy here because I think that as we think about equity and about flex work and who works on campus and who can do their work somewhere besides on campus, I think it has to be about the work. And some work lends itself to being done anywhere. And some work absolutely doesn't. And, that sounds like that may sound harsher than everybody do the same thing. I think it's more equitable if and only if we are super upfront with our staff from the very beginning about what the expectations of particular kinds of work are. I think when it's only when we aren't clear with folks that, this is a job, I'll pick a job example, if your job is to drive the delivery van to take physical items from, from site to site across a campus, you can't do that from anywhere. You have to do that in the van on campus. And I can't be anything, I can't be anything but honest with the staff who are working in that job or applying for those kinds of jobs about what the expectations about where you work are. And as all of us have said, we do owe it to all of our staff, whether they're working, wherever they're working, to make sure that their workplace is as safe and as possible, and that we are tending to their wellness.
Thank you. And Elaine, any thoughts that you would like to share on this balance of equity between support staff and administrative staff?
Yeah, I mean, to attach to what Chris was saying, there were inequities before the pandemic, right? So what we're looking at is a deeply systemic problem. The problem is that people of color and marginalized people are relegated to positions that are lower paying and are often deemed essential. That's the problem. And a library is not going to fix that in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so these are just inequities within our society and our systems, and they will just continue through the pandemic. And we have a responsibility to understand, like, well, how is it that the Black women are the most underpaid? Like, we could do that work, but if that work's not going to be done, August 1st when classes start, or September. If any of you say you had solutions when you reopened in the fall, I would have to just question whether or not you're really working on a solution, or if you're just doing some checkbox diversity, checkbox equity, because you can't fix it by the time you open. It's just not possible. If you fix something, it's not going to be anything systemic or anything of substantial value.
Thank you. And Terry, would you like to share any points?
Sure. All really great points. We also do not have faculty status, but there are elements of caste systems that exist on all campuses, and we all confront those to a degree. I will say in the library, we're pretty careful about not making a distinction, from a team-based approach, so that whether you're support staff or salaried, everybody has a role on strategic planning. And so everyone gets to sort of buy in and lead. And I think that that's really important to underscore the sense of team. Obviously, there are laws that we have to abide by. So, we do that, as we all do. And there are times when my colleagues want us my support staff colleagues want us to sort of waive away some of those requirements, which I won't do, but we will have clear conversations. I will say one thing that we're trying to do at the college now, recognizing the imbalance, and I noticed a number of questions in the Q&A segment, is around this pay issue for people who are in the buildings, right? And for us, I will clarify that the people in the building during the pandemic has been a mix. We were able to, so some support, some professional, some leadership team. So we all shared the burden, but we also made sure that the building was safe for everyone. So that's really important. The second thing I would say is recognizing disparities. We are actually going to pay people at the lower end of the compensation rank much higher percentage-wise than people at the upper level. And that's actually college-wide, but I've done that in the past where I've actually not taken a salary and distributed that. I mean, I have taken a salary. I have not taken a raise, and distributed that extra income to my colleagues, because I think that we do have to be absolutely devoted to redressing the differentials. And I
Thank
can
you.
afford to do it.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you so much for all these fantastic points. And so our last question goes to Chris. And so, Chris, in what ways do principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility factor into your decision-making process regarding staffing models?
Yeah, thank you, Alexia. And I'm gonna, in the interest of time, there's so much to say about this topic. I'm gonna try and focus on some things, some issues that haven't come up yet as much. So a couple of
Thank
things
you.
that we're thinking about in terms of accessibility and inclusion, right? That we have learned through this, as someone said, a year and a half of mostly remote work. You know, I think we've all learned a lot about meeting cultures and decision-making norms and participation. And so I suspect this is true of a lot of folks that, for example, in our all staff meetings and for important events like candidate presentations for those jobs, we have been able to hire during the pandemic. So we have had some candidates come in and do virtual presentations to all staff. We've had much higher attendance and much higher participation and engagement than we did when those things were in person, both our all staff meetings and these kinds of presentations. So I think we have to figure out what is it about the online environment that is more accessible for many of our colleagues. I think that's a really important issue to address because I do think there's some evidence that accessibility has to do with making the environment more accessible for people who are neurodivergent, for people who have different interaction styles and learning styles and participation styles. And so, you know, to the extent that in some ways the Zoom environment is more accessible for many of our staff, we've got to capitalize on that even when we return to campus, whatever that looks like. I think those are some lessons that we need to take to heart and figure out how to keep what's good and accessible and welcoming about that, while also guarding against sort of recreating Zoom fatigue, right? I think we've also have to look at some things about our building. We also had this awesome opportunity to finish up a library renovation during this time period. And this sort of predated the pandemic, but I'm awfully glad that we were able to do this because by prioritizing a number of accessibility issues, this will have a benefit both to patrons and to staff. And one of the things that I really want to brag about our renovation is that it is, I think, one of the first buildings in the state, and certainly the first one at MIT, where every restroom in the building is designated from the start to be an all gender restroom.
Yep.
So I think that's really important. There's a bunch, we have a lactation room in the redesign, we have a wellness room in the redesign. I think there's lots of things that we're doing that are going to benefit staff and patrons as we come back to campus. There's so much more I could say, but I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A because I see the numbers growing in the Q&A box on the bottom of my Zoom.
Yes, and thank you so much for that, Chris, as well. I just want to check in with Teresa to see if you wanted to share some additional points. And everyone who is hanging in there with us, all 740 of you, thank you so much for your attendance and your patience. We may go over like 5 minutes to ensure that we can get to some of the questions. And then some of the detail has been answered throughout the discussion today. But yeah, Teresa, please feel free to share any points you may have.
Well, I'm just trying to decide. One of the things, Chris talked a little bit about diversity and staffing. And, I think one of the things, this doesn't necessarily deal completely with the pandemic, but I think it's been a problem that the profession has had, and I've been in it long enough to know. I had long hair and I didn't wear bifocals, and I've aged and we still got the same problem. We're 83% white. I just finished reading this fact, and it disturbs me that we aren't able to solve this problem. I mean, there have been so many task forces, roundtables, you name it, white papers, and we still have the problem. So I really want to say that when looking at DEI, it's really time to take this seriously. And I think Elaine has talked about, used the word systemic, and it is systemic in our libraries. And I feel passionate about this, so I don't want to go on too long here. But, as library leaders, we have to make this a priority and we have to set the tone. We do it on everything else. And I'll just say 3 things very quickly. We've learned, don't just hire one, hire more than one. I can remember going to meetings when that was revolutionary. Just don't hire one. Chris is shaking her head. She knows I'm talking about hire more than one. We know about mentorship and professional development. It still doesn't work. So what is so hostile about academic libraries?
Yeah.
And I've come to the realization that for people of color, I talk to young librarians all the time who are really struggling in these environments today in the 21st century with all of this diversity discussion going on. And I think as leaders and even in our audience, as colleagues, we need to be on the watch for certain words. If someone, a supervisor, a librarian comes to you, because we need to take it to the next stage now. We've got internships, we've got all these things. And someone comes to you and they say, oh, so-and-so, they're difficult, they're angry, they're aggressive, blah, 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 blah. Something needs to go off in your head immediately and say, what's going on here? Because we all know people don't walk around just being angry, so something's going on. And I really want to start challenging people to consider that this is just not a bad actor, whether it's a white librarian or an African-American librarian, but the words I just used are generally used for African-American librarians. So what else is going on here? We need to really get down to this. Are people tone policing people and other things that makes it uncomfortable for them? The other thing that happens in academic libraries a lot is people said, well, who are these people? And after people receive these ad hominem attacks all the time because it's ambiguous, I'm challenging people, don't use those words. Find other words to use to talk to people. And what happens is when this happens to people of color 4, 5, 6 times, then they're ready to go and it's a revolving door. I'll share one thing I read this week and then we can move on. The Harvard Business Review, I read in an article, they were talking about bias. And to eliminate bias, redact the name of the school and prior employers. And I thought, what a great idea, because in higher ed, we are so hung up, and in academic and research libraries, on where was the last place you worked? Mm-hmm. And if that's not the right school, you don't even get interviewed. And so that's something that I'm going to think about very seriously, because I thought that might make a difference. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And Mark, I'll go ahead because some of the questions are paragraphs and I want to streamline it as much as possible to get to the heart of some of the questions. And so Teresa, you provided us a really good runway for the heart of some of the query that's happening within the Q&A. And it's this idea around the practices of staff in terms of not supporting DEIA and most specifically not supporting equity initiatives. And so I want to turn this over to Elaine to begin. Elaine, what are the ways that you and your team are really addressing practices and behavior with staff towards each other from an equity and inclusion lens?
Yeah, I would say that we really want to focus on systems. I mean, to me, that's the best way to do it. Now, everything we don't look at is systemic, but one of the examples that is deeply problematic is policing security surveillance, right? And at the beginning of the pandemic, our biggest fear was making someone put on a mask. And then that invites policing and all these things that are deeply problematic. And so that is something that we want to revisit. Maybe not this year, but we have to really have a conversation about what is it that makes us feel good about having the police in the building, and who are they policing and for what purpose. And so that's just an example of, that's something that really is deep in in the work that we do, and the privilege that we have. And so that's going to be a serious discussion and understanding of what is it that we're trying to do, and how do we make some transformative change. And so that's the way you treat each other actually connects with the policing and surveillance, what expectations you have, who gets to be safe, who gets to be inconvenienced. I mean, this is how we treat each other. So I don't know if I actually got to your question, but to me, it's always the one-on-one, person-to-person stuff is important, but it always comes down to the implicit bias that is reared in systemic inequities that we have.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Elaine. And several of you have raised really important points around the systemic nature of practices within academic libraries, the systemic nature in terms of challenges that we face within higher education. Some of this feeds into a question that we have around, can you share your approach or strategies for communicating with your university administration when advocating for equitable staffing models in your libraries? And particularly if there has been any pushback in terms of opening up during the pandemic. So I want to turn this to Terry.
Yeah, fortunately, a really important priority for our campus and our president before, in terms of her coming to Haverford, was an equitable campus. It's been a real focus around what we're doing, what changes we need to implement and to be responsive. So I think that it is not just part of the library strategic plan, but the campus's strategic plan. So we're really, it's a top priority. The other thing I would say in terms of systemic change is, what can we do to change the system, not just within our campuses, but more broadly in terms of changing the pipeline around the profession, right? So, we're doing a series of postbacks where we're introducing first gen and BIPOC students to the field, and we're running internships with the TRICO and other liberal arts college libraries. So, whatever we can do to change the system, I think we all have some power to engage that, both locally at our institution and then collaboratively within the field.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions in here in relationship to kind of staff level equity. And I want to combine a couple of those questions and point this to you, Chris, because at the heart of one of the questions is the relationship with a collective bargaining unit, if it exists within the library. And so there's one question that's asking, if you have unions, have they been involved in this issue? And then there was another question around creating buy-in with staff who are normally not working on campus. And then there's a multitude of kind of commentary and questions around how do you balance a structured environment in a way in which it's fair, given the fact that different people have different types of work.
That's a whole bunch of questions in one.
It is.
And let me just start by saying, so the support staff at MIT Libraries organized back in the fall of 2019. And we are currently in the midst of negotiating our first collective bargaining agreement with that union. I feel good about the progress that we're making in those negotiations, and I feel pretty good that we will come to a collective bargaining agreement that actually works really well for both labor and management, and is based on some some shared values and shared commitment to the work. So I feel really good about that, but we're not there yet. We're still in the middle of the first bargaining for the first contract. I think that's probably all I can say about the union issue. What was the rest of the question there, Alexia?
So it was really more, Chris, around, given the fact that there could be a collective bargaining unit within the organization, how do you balance like an equitable staffing model? Seems to be the heart of combining several questions that have come through the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things that for example, being really clear with folks about what that it's about the work, not about people, right? So this is the kind of work that has to be done on campus, and I'll combine it with the question about advocating up a level, which is, I do think it's the responsibility of us in these leadership roles who have access to our provost and to the committees that are making decisions, to really be clear about, here's the priority services that, we think we can offer in a way that allows me to maintain equitable staffing models and keep everyone safe and, be fair about how people are working and where they're working. And here's some other services that you want us to provide, but actually maybe aren't as high a priority. And when I weigh those against the equity issues, I might advocate that I'm not going to offer those yet until I can find an equitable way to do that. And one of the ways, somebody asked, I think in the Q&A about how do you make those arguments? And one of the ways, again, local context, that I was able to win some arguments was we have a very large graduate student population here, and there was lots of faculty who were advocating for, being not pressuring graduate students to come back to work in labs. And I was like, we're not going to do that to grad students, then don't tell me to do that to my staff. I mean, this was, back at the beginning, but I think that there's local context about trying to be really flexible and nimble about which arguments are going to work in your particular context and for a particular issue. But I think all of them were around either equity within the library, equity within the institution, within the whole university. If we're not going to pressure graduate students to do a certain thing, then let's be fair to the rest of the staff too.
Great, thank you. And then there's one last question, everyone, and thank you again for hanging in there with us for this really fantastic conversation. So I've seen throughout the chat questions around, a lot of the programs and the practices that you all have shared are great. Is there sustainability to continue them? So will they continue post-pandemic? So I want to check in with Terry on this question to wrap us up.
I think it has to, right? I think we all have strategic plans. We have to be committed. We have to move it forward. And I think, I know my colleagues here have spent a lot of time making sure that that commitment isn't a series of check boxes, but something woven throughout the program. So I have no doubt that it will continue and it will get better. It has to, and it's our responsibility to lead that forward.
Thank you. And what a strong way to end. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Mark. What a delightful conversation and great Q&A. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you so much. Really just a big thank you, of course, to you, Alexia, for pulling this together, and to you, Teresa and Elaine and Chris and Terry. Just thank you so much for taking the time to participate in this conversation. As Alexia said, so much great stuff in there. And as just from the Q&A, really a lot of engagement from folks. So I'm just, thank you. I would just take a second to remind folks that we did record today's program. So please be on the lookout for a follow-up email with a link to the recording. You are welcome to share that recording with anyone that you would like. Thanks again to everyone out there for joining us today. I hope, of course, that you found the session informative, engaging. We'd like to, of course, see you on another webinar in the near future. But before we sign off, I would just encourage folks, there is a brief survey that should pop up on your browser. If you could take just 3 or 4 minutes max to give us a couple of responses, we would really appreciate that. Once again, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your taking the time to join us, and to our wonderful panel today as well. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Have a delightful day and a good week.